I mean, we were reflecting back on the King's words during the pandemic, saying that everyone needed to do everything they could to help the NHS. And then we found out that he's charging the NHS millions of pounds
for a garage for the ambulances.
For a garage for the ambulances.
Who pays for the royals? An investigation by the Sunday Times Insight team is lifting the lid on the secrets of the wealth of the royal family. The in-depth examination into the financial workings of the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall has revealed some interesting details previously shrouded in secrecy about how King Charles and Prince William accumulate their wealth. Now, they've done a partnership with Channel 4's Dispatches. Well, here to tell us more, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by George Arbuthnott, who is the Sunday Times' Insight Investigations Deputy Editor. George, thank you so much for coming in to see us. Just give us a flavour of the main headlines of this story. What have you discovered?
Yeah, so we've spent 5 months going through previously unpublished records of the King and the Prince's properties that they own around the country. And we found 5,000 of them. And we've used those properties to uncover the secret business deals that the King and the Prince are using to maintain their multi-millionaire status. And the key line at the top is that they are making millions of pounds a year by levying charges on public services like the armed forces, the NHS, schools, charities and the general public, while claiming that they don't rely on taxpayers' money for their private wealth.
So just explain that to us. So that how are they sort of taking money from what kind of things are people paying them for?
So they own these vast estates. They include land, seashores, properties, and public services have to operate, have to kind of work across them. Like, for example, the RNLI, for example, with the lifeboats, have to use the royal shores in order to save people. And even though the King's the patron of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, he is levying charges on the lifeboat stations in order to use his shores. And so that's kind of an example of how they're...
Okay, that's and give some other examples of the kinds of things that they're sort of charging for. So that's like lifeboats.
Yeah, so the armed forces, for example, are being charged to train on Dartmoor National Park, which the King owns, even though he's the head of the armed forces. The Prince of Wales, Prince William, happens to own the land underneath Dartmoor Prison, and he's charging £37 million over 25 years to the taxpayer to allow prisoners to use the prison. There's the King only last year struck a deal with the NHS, which needed a garage space to put some new ambulances that they were buying to try and tackle ambulance waiting times. And at the time, the Duchy put out a press release saying that they were happy to have granted a warehouse to the NHS. But we've discovered that in reality, they are charging millions of pounds, in fact, £11 million over 15 years for the NHS trust to use it.
Gosh, I mean, these are substantial sums of money. They're not sort of nominal peppercorn sort of fees. These are substantial amounts of money. So what you've basically discovered is, as well as being very wealthy and having, getting an allowance from the state and having all of this land, they are actually charging many public services a lot of money for the use. Now, is there any illegality alleged here? Are they breaking any rules by doing this?
So they're not breaking rules. I mean, the one area that there is question marks over, in fact, where they've broken rules, is that they also rent out a number of residential properties. And new laws came in over recent years to try and tackle climate change, which meant that those properties, when you rent them out, have to reach a minimum energy efficiency standard. And what we've discovered is that dozens of properties owned by the King do not meet those minimum standards, which could result in a fine if you're found to have breached the rules.
But also, the king is such a supporter of environmental issues and is a great champion.
That's right.
Of.
It does seem ironic. So we put this to the Duchy of Lancaster, which is the king's private estate, and they admitted actually that about 1 in 8 of their properties were not hitting the standards that are legally required. And the properties that don't have exemptions, they have scheduled works to try and improve them. But the truth is, you're not supposed to rent them out before you've done the works, and that's the problem here.
So, look, George, why is this important, and what do you think? What do you think is going to happen as a result of this? What do you think will be the kind of fallout from this investigation? Why does this matter?
So we've spoken to 2 former chairs of the Public Accounts Select Committee. One is Sir Edward Lee, who's a Conservative MP, who says it's wrong for the royals to be profiting from public services. And we've also spoken to Margaret Hodge.
And we're just about to speak with Margaret, actually. Yeah, she's going to be joining us in a moment.
Yeah, Baroness Hodge. So she also previously looked into the Duchy's affairs as part of her work on the committee. And she thinks it's wrong that the duchies aren't subject to any corporation tax or capital gains tax, even though they're operating like kind of profiteering commercial landlords.
Okay. Well, look, George, stay with us, and let's now bring in Margaret Hodge into the conversation. Baroness Hodge. Margaret, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aisha.
And it's worth saying that, as George just alluded to, when you were in the Commons, Margaret, you were chair of the Public Accounts Select Committee, a very powerful select committee which did lots of digging into, the public finances. Look, your reaction to what you've heard, and just explain to our listeners why this story is important.
I think it is a really important story, and it's because of this, Aisha, because the Crown says that it has a special status in relation to both the Duchy of Cornwall and the Duchy of Lancaster. And because it has that status, it, for example, doesn't pay, as you've said, corporation tax and capital gains tax. And we also don't know whether sufficient income tax and VAT is paid on the income and the goods that are sold through the 2 duchies. Yet, so it claims this special status, yet it operates like a private company. And if it wants to operate in a commercial private way, it should actually pay tax. So it's got to decide, is it going to be public or is it going to be private? And if it's going to be public, it's got to be much, much, much more transparent on what it owns, how it makes its money, who it demands rent and income from. And that then has to pass what I call the public smell test. And I think that the investigation that has been so brilliantly done by by these investigative journalists, I think a lot of what they've uncovered doesn't, for me, pass that public smell test of ethical behaviour.
And so, Margaret, what's your reaction to this whole thing, just generally?
Well, I think we need transparency. We need to understand what's happening. When we looked at this now, it's almost 10 years ago. And the reason we looked at it was that issues around both the duchies emerged in the leaks of the Paradise Papers. And at that time, it was the Duchy of Cornwall, which is really run by both the King and now by the Duke of Cornwall. They chair the board, was at that point involved in a commercial company that had rainforests in one of our tax havens, and the King, who was then Prince Charles, was lobbying to be able to take advantage of the tax credits were around for carbon, to control carbon. To try and control carbon emissions. So he was lobbying for something that would have benefited his private company, using his public position so to do, lobbying Gordon Brown, lobbying the Commission in Europe, lobbying MEPs. And that seemed to us wrong. And I think the answer has to be that we have transparency around it. And if they are doing commercial business, one has to ask the question, should they or should they not be paying corporation tax and capital gains tax? And to put it into its context, Aisha, both these duchies have made a heck of a lot of money. Last year, one made 24 million, the other made 27 million in profits. And yet at the same time, the sovereign grant has increased every year under a deal that was struck by George Osborne. And the sovereign grant is now over £100 million. And that's public money. That's your money, my money, it's taxpayers' money. And one has to ask that with that wealth, which is supposed to be wealth associated with the crown, do they also need that much public money to ensure that they can carry on the duties which go with the positions that they hold?
I mean, George, from what Margaret has just said there, it feels like the issue here is either you're a special case and you're the royal family and you get these privileges and you get this money from the state to carry out your duties, or you're a commercial entity and you have to play by the rules. And is that your sort of, do you agree with Margaret there?
Well, it's a moral point, isn't it? I mean, the king is worth, according to the Sunday Times Rich List, £610 million. And these are estates that were largely seized by the medieval monarchs centuries ago, often with the use of the country's armed forces, effectively. And is it right that they're using those estates to, and I should add, make close to £600,000 by levying rents from state schools, making money by charging churches, village halls, playing fields, local sports grounds, the ambulance service, lifeboat stations, and even the charities that they've been encouraging the public to donate to. So, for example, the King, over the last 20 years, has made millions of pounds in rents from a London building where Comic Relief and Macmillan Cancer Support have been paying for offices. And he's actually the patron of Macmillan, but he hasn't declared the fact that he's receiving huge sums of the charity's money. He's also the patron of the Scouts, and he's charging the Scouts for access to one of his huts.
Right. I mean,
if I can come in on that,
yeah.
I think that's one of the most worrying aspects of the story that we're learning about today. There we have some really important charities, Macmillan Cancer Care and Marie Curie, in a building. The patron of both those charities is our king. And yet the king is making a lot of money. The figures that I've seen from the story is over the period of, there's over £16 million being charged to Macmillan Cancer, of which the king gets a third, and over £9 million being charged to Marie Curie, again, of which the king gets a third. And the rent is so high that both those charities have chosen to leave the building. And where the moral test comes, where the smell test comes in, is if you are patron of a charity, and it is a charity, and you own the building, is it morally right that you should be charging these very high rents, which then make a profit for what is it personal income? Is it crown income? But it is wealth that you enjoy.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose other people will just even, take a step back and say, look, the royal family is in this incredibly privileged position where it does get this vast amount of money from the taxpayer. We all know, having just been through the budget this week, and we're going to be doing lots more budget analysis, that this country's public finances are in dire straits. And, we've got so many public services that are absolutely strapped for cash. I suppose some people will just be thinking, is it right for the royal family, which already enjoys all these privileges, George, to then be kind of creaming off all this extra money without paying tax from services and charities, which it would be out snipping ribbons for and saying, oh, well done, you're doing a fabulous job, you're the backbone of our society?
That's right. I mean, we were reflecting back on the King's words during the pandemic, saying that everyone needed to do everything they could to help the NHS. And then we found out that he's charging the NHS millions of pounds.
For a garage for the ambulances.
For a garage for the ambulances. And then a school that he visited and, received letters of condolence when the Queen died from the kids. And it turns out that he's charging them, large sums of rent every year,
Okay.
which hasn't never been made public.
Look, final question to you, Margaret. What should happen next? Where does this story go next? Is it? Do you think the new Labour government will look into this? Is it time to tighten up the rules on the royal family around this?
Well, I do think that I heard Rachel in her speech say that there was going to be a review of the sovereign grant. And I think if she said that, if I heard it right, I think that's appropriate. But that should be reviewed in the context of both the Duchy of Cornwall and the Duchy of Lancaster. I think we just need transparency. And once we get transparency, we can see whether it's fair. I mean, there was another thing, Aisha, that we honed in on when we looked at these finances, and I say this was some years ago, but the Duchy of Cornwall, for example, if you die intestate without a will, your assets go to the Duchy of Cornwall, and then the Duchy is to distribute them to charities. That sounds perfectly sensible until you find that when the King, as Prince, was running the Duchy of Cornwall, some of that charitable money went to Gordonston School to provide for the fees of people to attend that school that he'd attended. And other went to the Isles of Scilly to promote marketing. And of course, the Duchy of Cornwall owns a lot of properties in the Isle of Scilly. So again, indirectly, they profit from it.
Okay.
So there are a lot of questions that need actually, I think, a proper review, open and transparent, so that we all be satisfied if they're doing the right thing.
Well, Margaret and George, what an interesting conversation. And you can read that full story online right now by going to thetimes.com. You can read all of George's work there.